In the heart of the ancient world, where the marble stones of Rome gleamed white beneath the Mediterranean sun, there existed a world that few would name, yet many endured. It was the world of the enslaved, countless souls bound in chains, silent. Pillars that bore the weight of an empire. The city rose like a jewel of power, its streets lined with triumphal arches, its temples crowned with golden roofs, its arenas roaring with the voices of thousands. Yet beneath this splendor stretched the shadow of bondage. For in every street, every villa, every field beyond the walls, there moved the quiet figures of those who were not free. They came from conquered lands. From the hills of Gaul, tall men with hair the color of sunlit straw. From Greece, scholars. And tutors, bearers of knowledge older than Rome herself. From Africa, with eyes dark as midnight, brought across seas to toil in households and quarries. From the east, artisans, scribes, and servants, their tongues strange to Roman ears. All had been torn from their homelands, herded like cattle, and cast into the markets of the eternal city. The slave market was a place of noise and humiliation. There, on wooden platforms, men and women were displayed as wares, their bodies examined, their teeth checked, their muscles pressed as one might test an ox. Around their necks hung tablets describing their strengths or their flaws. Healthy, strong, fit for labor, or prone to illness. Missing an eye, weak in the back. The auctioneer's voice rang out above the crowd. Coins clinked in eager hands. And lives were traded like amphorae of wine. Some were sold cheaply like broken tools. Others fetched sums greater than a horse, greater even than a villa, if their skills were rare. A Greek philosopher, versed in rhetoric, could command a fortune. A physician, able to mend wounds and heal sickness, was more precious than gold. Yet for all, the fate was the same: to belong not to themselves, but to another. Children were not spared. A child born of an enslaved woman inherited her chains. From the first breath, the child was not a son or daughter, but a possession. Small hands carried water jars, small feet ran errands, small backs bent beneath loads too heavy. Their laughter was brief, for play was a luxury, and duty began as soon as the body could stand. Day by day, the enslaved were scattered across the vastness of Rome. In the countryside, they tilled the soil on great estates, latifundia that stretched across valleys like kingdoms of their own. From dawn until the setting of the sun, they bent beneath the weight of harvest, binding sheaves of grain, tending vineyards heavy with grapes, pressing olives into oil. Sweat soaked their tunics, dust caked their skin, and their lives were measured not in years, but in the fields they cleared, the crops they gathered, the lashes they endured. In the mines, the darkness swallowed them, narrow tunnels carved into. Mountains echoed with the ring of picks, the groan of bodies straining, the cough of lungs choked with dust. Torches sputtered, shadows danced, and men labored until their bones broke and their eyes dimmed. Few returned to see the sky again. In such places, life was not counted in years, but in months, even days. In the city, others moved silently through the villas of the wealthy. They cooked meals of roasted meats and spiced wines, meals they themselves would never taste. That they washed marble floors until they shone, brushed the hair of noble women into intricate braids, poured wine for senators as they reclined in their triclinia, laughing and plotting the fates of nations. They stood behind their masters in silence, their faces expressionless, their ears hearing secrets whispered in confidence. Some were fortunate, if fortunate could be called. A master who prized loyalty might grant a slave comfort, education, even the faint hope of manumission freedom granted after years of service. Yet such hope was rare, and even then the freed were bound by ties of gratitude and obligation, forever marked by the chains they once bore. Punishments were harsh. A runaway was branded, an iron collar clasped around the neck, its inscription declaring him a fugitive to all who read it. A thief might be beaten, or worse, cast into the arena. To fight beasts for the amusement of the crowd, a murderer could bring doom not only upon himself, but upon his household. For the law decreed that all the slaves of a slain master must be put to death whether guilty or not. Yet even within chains, humanity endured. In the dark corners of kitchens, slaves whispered songs from their homelands. In the fields, they shared stories, passing memory from one tongue to another, weaving a tapestry of forgotten nations. In the quiet of night, they prayed to gods old and new, seeking comfort where none could be found. And sometimes they rose in the gladiator schools where men trained to fight for the pleasure of crowds, their burned embers of defiance. One such ember was Spartacus, a Thracian taken captive, forced into the arena. He was strong, skilled, but above all, unwilling to die for sport. With a band of fellow gladiators, he escaped, seizing weapons, fleeing to the hills. From there, his rebellion grew, swelling with thousands of slaves who hungered not for conquest, but for freedom. For 2 years they defied Rome, defeating legion after legion, shaking the empire to its core. But the might of Rome was vast, and in the end, the rebellion was crushed. Spartacus fell, his body never found, but his followers, 6,000 strong, were crucified along the Appian Way. For miles, the road was lined with crosses, a forest of suffering, a warning carved into flesh. The lesson was clear. Defiance would be answered with death. And yet, the story of Spartacus lived, whispered among the enslaved, carried like a secret flame from one generation to another. Among the philosophers of Rome, voices rose in uneasy thought. Seneca, the Stoic, wrote that slaves were men, that they laughed, wept, and felt hunger just as their masters did. He urged kindness, restraint, humanity. Rome was not ready to listen. Slavery was the foundation of its power, the engine of its economy, the hidden army that built its temples and harvested its fields. To question it was to question Rome itself. And so the empire endured, and so did the chains. Yet even chains cannot silence memory. In graffiti scratched upon walls and prayers carved into stone, in the fragments of poems, we hear the voices of those who lived and died in bondage. One wrote, "Upon gaining freedom, at last I am my own." Another prayed simply, "For peace in death, if not in life." Their words are few, scattered like ashes, but they are enough. Enough to remind us that they were not shadows, not tools, not nameless bodies. They were human. Rome has fallen. Its emperors are dust. Its palaces are ruins. Its legions gone. But the slaves who built its greatness remain, not in monuments, but in memory. Their worth was not in coins, nor in skills, nor in beauty. Their worth was in their humanity, as eternal as Rome itself once claimed to be. Beyond the marble walls of Rome, the countryside stretched like an endless sea, fields golden with grain, vineyards heavy with grapes, olive groves whispering in the wind. Here, too, slavery reigned, though the world was wide and open. Vast estates, the latifundia, swallowed the land, owned by nobles and senators whose wealth was measured not only in coin, but in the number of souls they commanded. From sunrise, the enslaved rose. The air was cool, the sky pale, yet already the overseer's voice cracked like a whip. Men trudged into the fields, iron tools clutched in weary hands. They bent low, sowing seeds, their backs curving into the very earth they tilled. Others drove oxen, guiding wooden plows through heavy soil. Sweat gathered on brows before the sun had climbed high. Women labored too. They carried water from distant wells, their shoulders bent beneath the weight of clay jars. They gathered herbs, tended gardens, spun wool into coarse thread. Some worked side by side with men, binding sheaves of wheat, their hands raw, their arms bruised from the strain. Children darted between them, not free to play, but carrying baskets, scaring birds from crops, fetching tools. Their laughter was rare, often silenced by a stern glance or a swift blow. Childhood was short, for in bondage. Years of innocence were a luxury none could afford. As the sun blazed, the fields shimmered with heat. Dust clung to skin, throats grew dry, yet rest was fleeting. Overseers with whips patrolled the rows, their eyes sharp, their tempers cruel. A stumble might earn a lash, a delay might bring punishment. Work was life, and to falter was to risk suffering, even death. At harvest time, the toil grew harsher. Grain must be gathered before storms came, grapes pressed before they soured. Nights stretched long, filled with the sound of threshing, of presses groaning, of bodies laboring past exhaustion. Fires burned. In the distance, torches lighting the endless work. Songs rose, low and weary, voices carrying the rhythms of foreign lands. The mines were darker still. Far from the fields, deep within the mountains, slaves descended into tunnels black as the grave. Torches flickered, smoke stung eyes, and the air was thick with dust. Picks struck stone, iron rang on rock, and echoes rolled like thunder. Men coughed blood, their chests heaving, lungs seared by the breath of the earth. Chains clinked in the dark. Prisoners, criminals, the condemned, these filled the mines, their sentences not written on parchment, but carved into their flesh. Few returned. From such places, their bones lay buried beneath the stone, their names lost to the silence of the deep. Yet within the city, life for some slaves took a different shape. In the grand villas where marble columns gleamed and fountains sparkled, servants moved like shadows. They cooked feasts of roasted meats, seasoned with herbs and honey, for masters who reclined on couches. Their laughter loud, their voices careless. They poured wine into silver cups, fanned their lords with peacock feathers, carried water to cool their hands. Slaves dressed their mistresses in silks and velvets imported from the East. They braided hair to elaborate towers, fastened jewels at throats, whispered advice on matters both trivial and grave. Some became confidants, keepers of secrets that could topple reputations. Yet trust was fragile, for loyalty bought no freedom, and affection could not break chains. Others were prized for their minds. Tutors from Greece taught the sons of Rome to speak with eloquence, to read Homer and Plato, to debate in the style of philosophers. Physicians tended to wounds and illnesses, their knowledge gleaned from centuries of study. Secretaries wrote letters, kept accounts, guided the affairs of wealthy households, but even these, who dined well and slept in comfort, were never free. At a master's whim, they could be beaten, sold, or discarded. Their talents were tools, their lives property. Punishments were many. Slave who ran was hunted like an animal. Collars of iron were fastened around their necks, engraved with words, "I have run away. Return me to my master." A thief might be whipped until flesh tore or branded with fire. A conspirator might be crucified, nailed to wood along the roads, his body left to rot in the sun as a warning. Cruelty was not always born of anger. It was law, custom, the machinery of Rome. The death of a master could doom his entire household. When Pedonius Secundus, a senator, was murdered by one of his slaves, the law decreed that all 400 of his servants must die, and so they did, despite the pleas of the people. Justice in Rome was swift, relentless, without pity, yet kindness, too, existed in fragments. Some masters, guided by philosophy or compassion, treated slaves with gentleness, granting them respect, even paths to freedom. A faithful servant might be manumitted, released from bondage to live as a freedman. Such freedom was precious, rare. As gold, a freed slave became a libertus, bound still by duty to his patron, yet granted a taste of life his children might inherit in full. Tiro, the secretary of Cicero, was one such man. Once a slave, he was freed, and his skill with words preserved the legacy of his master. His shorthand shaping the letters of Rome, Publilius Syrus, once a slave, became a writer, his wit sharp. His sayings remembered long after his death. Epictetus, born in chains, found freedom, and through philosophy declared that no man is truly free unless he masters himself. But for every Tiro, for every Cyrus, there were thousands who remained nameless. Their bones lay in fields, their sweat built aqueducts, their blood-stained arenas. They were the unseen, the countless, the forgotten. Rome's grandeur stood upon their shoulders. The Colosseum's stones were dragged by their hands. The aqueducts that carried water to the city were raised by their toil. The feasts that filled noble tables were prepared by their labor, and though their names are gone, their presence lingers, silent yet eternal. For without them, Rome would not have risen, nor endured. Night fell upon the empire, yet even then the enslaved did not rest. In kitchens, fires smoldered, pots simmered, bread baked. In stables, horses were tended, hooves cleaned, straw laid fresh. In bedrooms, lamps burned low, and shadows stood by to fetch, to serve, to wait. Beyond the city, under stars bright above the countryside, the enslaved lay on straw, their bodies aching, their dreams fleeting. Some dreamt of freedom, of homelands lost, of voices of family long gone. Others dreamt not at all, for sleep was brief, and dawn came swift. The empire slumbered, but its foundation did not. In every whisper of wind across the fields, in every drop of sweat that darkened the soil, in every breath taken in shadow, the enslaved endured. In the silence of Rome's grandeur, beneath the weight of its temples and the pride of its legions, there grew whispers, whispers of defiance. Chains clattered in the night, and hearts that had long bent in submission stirred with a faint, dangerous fire. For though Rome was mighty, though her legions stretched from desert to forest, within her veins flowed the labor of millions who dreamed of breaking free from the gladiatorial schools, where men were trained not as citizens, but as instruments. Of blood, one such fire blazed into a storm. His name was Spartacus, a Thracian, once a soldier, captured and cast into chains. In the arena, he fought, his strength admired, his skill unmatched. Yet his spirit remained unbowed. In the year of 73 before Christ, the embers of rebellion sparked. With a band of 70 gladiators, Spartacus broke his bonds, seizing weapons meant for spectacle, turning them against their masters. They fled into the hills, wild and desperate, and from there their numbers swelled. Slaves from farms abandoned their plows, from kitchens abandoned their pots, from mines abandoned their picks. They gathered men and women alike, tens of thousands, drawn not by promises of conquest, but by the hope of freedom. Rome trembled. Legions marched against them, proud and disciplined, yet time and again they fell. Spartacus, with nothing but will and fury, broke their lines, shattered their formations, and sent survivors fleeing. The rebels carved out a shadow realm within Italy itself, a kingdom of fugitives where chains were melted down into weapons, and slaves stood as brothers in arms. For 2 years, they defied the empire. Victories piled upon victories in the senates. Pride turned to fear. But Rome's might was vast, and no rebellion could stand against it forever. When the final battle came, the fields were soaked with blood. Spartacus fought to the end, carving a path through the enemy, his blade flashing, its roar rising above the clash of steel. He fell there, his body lost among thousands, never to be found. The survivors, 6,000 men, were taken. Along the Appian Way, Rome's great road, crosses were raised. On each, a body was nailed, crucified beneath the burning sun. Mile after mile, the road became a forest of death, the moans of the dying carried on the wind. Travelers passed between. Them, eyes averted, hearts chilled, the message clear: defiance would be crushed, utterly and without mercy. Yet the story of Spartacus did not die. It lingered in whispers, in secret songs, in glances shared between slaves as they toiled. It became a flame hidden in the heart, a reminder that even chains could not bind the spirit forever. Other revolts rose, though none so vast. In Sicily, the great island of grain, slaves rose in fury, burning estates, seizing towns. Twice they defied Rome, twice they were drowned in blood. Each time, the empire rebuilt, more cruel, more watchful. Yet the memory of those uprisings remained, proof that beneath obedience lay a dangerous strength. Rome knew it. That was why fear was their greatest weapon. Fear of the lash, fear of the cross, fear of punishment not only for the guilty but for all. If one slave struck a master, the whole household might perish. The law was not justice, it was terror, wielded to keep millions in silence. But silence was never complete. In the writings of philosophers, in the margins of history, doubts appeared. Seneca, the Stoic, looked upon slaves and saw not property, but men. He wrote that masters should eat beside their servants, that cruelty was folly, that laughter and tears, hunger and thirst, belonged to all alike. He urged his peers to remember that fortune shifts and that the proudest master could one day fall into chains himself. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, pondered the unity of mankind. To him, all were sparks of the same divine fire, bound together by reason. And yet, even under his rule, the chains remained, for philosophy bowed to tradition and tradition. To power, others were harsher. Some declared that slavery was natural, that the strong must rule the weak, that conquest granted ownership of body and soul. They spoke of order, of law, of necessity, blind to the suffering it bred. Thus Rome lived. In contradiction, her citizens boasted of freedom of libertus as the highest gift of the gods. They prided themselves on laws, on justice, on the dignity of citizenship. Yet for every citizen who walked proudly, there were 3 slaves who bent their backs unseen. Liberty for some, bondage for many, and still in the hidden corners the enslaved found ways to resist. Not always with swords, not always with rebellion, but with subtler weapons. A tool misplaced, a task delayed, a secret theft of food, a whispered story of freedom. They clung to their humanity in small acts, each defiance a spark against the darkness. Some sought freedom through service. Years of loyalty could win manumission, the solemn ceremony in which a master declared a slave free. A hand placed upon the head, words spoken, a scroll signed, and chains fell away. Freedmen became liberti, still tied to their patrons, yet able to marry, to trade, to build lives their children might inherit. Some grew wealthy, merchants and bankers, their descendants blending into the fabric of Rome itself. Others found freedom only in death. Bodies burned upon pyres, ashes scattered to the wind. They returned to the earth unchained. In tombs, some carved their pleas. Here lies one who was once a slave. May the gods grant rest. Their epitaphs stand as quiet testimonies to lives endured, not celebrated. Rome marched on, its empire vast, its power unmatched. But beneath its triumphs, beneath its marble and gold, the enslaved endured a hidden multitude. Their voices were few, their names forgotten, yet their labor was endless. They were the silent heartbeat of empire, and without them, Rome would have been no more than a city by the Tiber. It's forgotten in time, and so the paradox of Rome deepened. An empire of freedom built on chains, republic of laws sustained by injustice, a people who sang of liberty while silencing millions. In that paradox lies the truth not of emperors or generals, but of those who bore the weight of empire without glory, without name, without hope but for endurance, beyond the lash and the labor, beyond the clamor of markets and the silence of minds. There lay another world, the inner world of those bound in chains. Though their bodies were possessions, their minds wandered freely, clinging to memory, to faith, to fragments of hope. At night, when the fires dimmed and the overseer's voice grew distant, the slaves gathered in shadows, in courtyards, in stables. In the corners of kitchens, they whispered the songs of their homelands. Songs in tongues strange to Roman ears, songs carried across seas and mountains. Songs of rivers that no longer flowed before their eyes, of mountains they would never climb again. These songs were lifelines, threads binding them to identities Rome sought to erase. Some prayed to the gods of their birth. Egyptians murmured to Isis, Gauls to Tyrannus, Africans to spirits older than Rome itself. Others bent before Jupiter, Venus or Mercury, adopting the gods of their masters, while secretly calling upon their own. Religion became both a prison and a refuge. The temples of Rome reminded them of their subjugation. Yet in the quiet prayers of night, They found strength no master could break. There were slaves who carved tiny altars from scraps of wood hidden beneath beds of straw. A small figurine, a painted stone, a fragment of bone, these became sacred, talismans of endurance. The overseer might smash them if discovered, yet the enslaved would make another. For belief was as necessary as bread. Family among the enslaved was fragile. Husbands and wives were torn apart by sales, parents separated from children, brothers scattered across provinces, yet wherever chance allowed, they clung to kinship. A man would call another brother, though no blood bound them. A woman would cradle an orphan as her own child. In bonds forged not by lineage but by survival, families were remade, broken, and remade again. Children were the most fragile, yet also the most resilient. They were born into chains, their first breath already claimed by another. They toddled on dirt floors, carrying water jars before they could speak, sweeping courtyards before they could read. Their childhood was short, their innocence devoured by necessity, yet within them burned sparks of laughter, of mischief, of imagination. They chased each other through fields, fashioned toys from sticks and stones, sang songs half-remembered from their mothers. Even in bondage, the human spirit sought joy. But joy was fleeting, for danger lingered always. A child could be sold, without warning, carried away to another household, another land, never to see mother or father again. Tears stained the dust, but labor did not cease, for Rome cared little for sorrow. The marketplace was indifferent, the coins cold, the contracts merciless. Still, love persisted. In whispered vows exchanged in kitchens, in the clasp of hands in fields, in stolen kisses at midnight, bonds formed. Rome did not recognize their marriages, yet among themselves they were sacred. Two souls bound by chains, yet bound also by devotion. Masters might sneer, but the enslaved knew the truth that love, fragile as it was, made life bearable. The lives of women bore special burdens. They worked as hard as men, yet their bodies were also claimed as property.
Some served
As handmaidens to noble women, brushing hair, dressing in silks, arranging jewels. Others were concubines, compelled to share their masters' beds. For them, choice was a dream denied, their dignity stolen daily. Children born of such unions bore the mark of their mother's bondage, condemned before they could even walk. Yet, women were also pillars of endurance. They carried not only water and grain, but also memory. They taught children songs, stories, the names of ancestors. Around fires, they told tales of faraway rivers and mountains, of gods who watched and listened, of lands where no chains existed. In their voices, heritage survived, carried like embers across generations. Among men, strength was often measured by endurance. To carry heavier loads, to swing the pick longer, to withstand the lash without a cry, these became quiet marks of pride. Yet there were also men who resisted not through strength, but through cunning. They learned the moods of overseers, the rhythms of households, the small ways to steal moments of rest or scraps of food. They survived by wit, their rebellion hidden in subtlety. Festivals in Rome brought mixed feelings. For citizens, they were days of joy, parades, games, spectacles in the arena. For slaves, they were days of labor, preparing feasts, cleaning streets, serving revelers. Yet in the noise of the crowd, in the anonymity of festivals, some slaves found brief freedom. They mingled unseen, their chains hidden beneath the swirl of dancers, their songs blending with the music of lutes and flutes. For an hour, perhaps, a day, they felt part of the city, not apart from it. Philosophers in Rome sometimes spoke of slaves with sympathy, sometimes with contempt. One declared that a slave was nothing more than a tool with a voice. Another argued that fortune alone divided master from servant, and that fate could reverse at any time. But philosophy rarely eased the burdens of those in chains. Fine words and scrolls did little to lighten the loads on weary shoulders, yet ideas mattered. They filtered down, slowly, into the minds of masters, shaping laws, granting small mercies. A master might hesitate before cruelty, reminded by Stoic writings that the gods watched, that virtue demanded restraint. A few even freed slaves, moved by conscience, though many did so only in death, leaving freedom as a final gesture in their wills. Manumission was both blessing and bond. A freedman carried gratitude toward his former master, now his patron. Owed loyalty, service, respect, yet he also carried pride, for he was no longer property. His children, born in freedom, could rise as citizens, soldiers, merchants. In them, the chains of the past began to rust away. The freed walked among the enslaved as living proof that hope was not entirely illusion. Some grew rich, owning shops, lending money, even purchasing slaves of their own, a bitter irony, a cycle repeating itself. Others lived modestly, grateful simply to belong to themselves. The shadow of rebellion remained. Spartacus had fallen, yet his memory lingered. In whispers, in dreams, his name was spoken. In Sicily, in Campania, in Gaul, small uprisings flared and were crushed, yet each reminded Rome that beneath the silence lay fury. The masters knew this. They feared not only swords but also unity. They divided slaves by language, by origin, by task, ensuring that those from Gaul worked apart from those from Greece, that Africans did not toil beside Thracians. Division was their shield, for unity was Rome's peril. Still in kitchens, in fields, in whispers, unity flickered. A Gaul taught a Greek his songs, an African told a Thracian of his homeland, a Syrian carved a charm for an Iberian. Slowly bonds formed, fragile but real, stretching across tongues, and nations Rome sought to erase their identities, but the enslaved wove new ones. Were not only Gauls, Greeks, Africans, Syrians. They were brothers and sisters in chains, bound not by blood but by suffering. Out of that suffering grew a strange kind of nation, unseen yet enduring, whose borders were the walls of Rome itself, and in their hearts. One truth remained unbroken, that though Rome might own their bodies, their spirits were beyond her reach. Death was never far from the lives of the enslaved. It lingered in the dust of the fields, in the black smoke of the mines, in the shadowed corners of kitchens where coughs racked weary lungs. It waited in the clatter of the whip, in the crash of collapsing stone, in the fever that burned through villages. For those in chains, life was fragile, and death was a companion they knew too well. When death came, it did not come with dignity. A slave who collapsed in the fields might be carried aside, left beneath a tree, his body unmarked save for the lashes on his back. In the mines, men buried their fellows in shallow graves dug from the earth they had broken, the sound of picks echoing still above their heads. In the city, slaves who died in service were sometimes burned in unmarked pyres, their ashes scattered without prayer, for their masters cared more for coin than memory. And yet memory endured, kept alive by those who loved them. Companions whispered the names of the dead, fearing that silence would erase them from the earth entirely. Women sang lullabies over lifeless children, their voices trembling but steady, so that even in death the little ones might be carried into the beyond with love. Some masters allowed proper burial. Tombstones of freedmen, carved with words of pride, sometimes mentioned the years spent in bondage, a shadow never erased. Here lies Marcus, once a slave, faithful in service, now free in death. Others bore simpler inscriptions, at rest. For many, even such stones were denied, and only the soil remembered. Funerary rites were diverse, for the enslaved came from every corner of the world. Egyptians prayed to Anubis to guide souls through the underworld. The Greeks called upon Hades, and Persephone offering libations of wine and honey. Africans poured water upon the ground, invoking ancestors to welcome the departed. Romans themselves burned bodies upon pyres, the smoke rising toward the heavens, carrying souls to the realm of shades. Among the enslaved, these rites blended. A man from Gaul might be laid upon a Roman pyre, while an African woman whispered prayers in her tongue. In death, as in life, identities mingled, forming a tapestry woven from loss and endurance. The fear of dying forgotten haunted many. To live nameless was sorrow. To die nameless was despair. That was why graffiti scratched into walls mattered. A line carved by a trembling hand declared, "I was here," simple words, yet they defied oblivion. Others left symbols, drawings, of ships, birds, or the sun marks that spoke silently. I lived. Even in chains, the enslaved sought meaning in death. Some believed their spirits would be freed, unbound by iron, roaming fields, untouched by toil. Others feared that bondage followed, into the afterlife, that masters might command even beyond the grave. To guard against this, some slaves buried tokens with the dead stones carved with protective signs. Herbs wrapped in cloth, coins to pay Quran for passage across the river of death. For those permitted proper rites, funerals could be moments of fragile dignity. Fellow slaves gathered, voices low, eyes downcast in case overseers watched. They carried the body on rough planks, laid it upon firewood, and lit the pyre. Flames rose crackling, sparks climbing into the night sky. Flicker, faces glistened with tears, though they wept silently, for to mourn too openly was dangerous. A reminder to masters that their property had been human after all, yet the silence was eloquent. The hush of dozens standing together, united in grief, spoke louder than wails. In that silence lay defiance, a claim that this life mattered, that this death must be remembered. Some masters, uneasy, forbade such gatherings, fearing they might become sparks of rebellion. But slaves found ways. In kitchens, they left bread beside a hearth for the departed. In fields, they carved small signs into trees. In mines, they pressed a handprint into wet clay walls, leaving a final mark before darkness swallowed them, death. There was also spectacle wielded by Rome as terror. Crucifixion was the empire's cruelest punishment, reserved for rebels and the defiant. Bodies hung on wooden crosses by roadsides, nailed and bound, left to the sun and birds. Travelers passed between forests of agony. The message seared into their minds, "Thus perishes all who defy Rome." For the enslaved, such sights were nightmare and prophecy. They knew that any act of rebellion might end there, their bodies swaying. In the wind, their names cursed into silence. And yet some chose defiance still, for to die free upon a cross was, for some, nobler than to live forever in chains. Philosophers wrote of death with calm detachment. Seneca spoke of it as natural, a release from suffering, a reminder that masters and slaves alike shared the same end. Death equalized, he said, for emperors and beggars alike walked into the same shadows. But for the enslaved, death was not equal. A master died with mourners, tombs, and memory. A slave often died unseen, forgotten. Philosophy gave little comfort. When reality was so cruel, and yet among the enslaved hope lingered even in death. Stories were told of ancestors who rose as stars, their spirits shining in the heavens. Others believed in rebirth, in souls returning to the world, perhaps free, perhaps noble. Some clung to the thought that beyond the veil lay no masters, no chains, only rest. The rituals of mourning became acts of quiet resistance. Every whispered name, every hidden offering, every secret prayer was a refusal to let Rome erase them. Memory itself became rebellion, for as long as they were remembered, they were not truly lost. There were tales of slaves who haunted their masters, spirits restless for justice. Rumors spread of footsteps in empty halls, of voices calling in the night, of shadows moving where none should be. Superstition grew, and even the powerful feared. For Rome might command bodies, but souls were beyond her grasp. Cemeteries held silent witnesses. Among rows of citizen tombs, there were humbler gravestones carved by trembling hands. Words etched by freedmen, for their kin still bound. Sometimes masters buried trusted servants beside themselves, inscriptions declaring, "Here lies a faithful companion." To Rome, it was loyalty. To the enslaved, it was irony. For even in death, they lay at the feet of those who once owned them. But not all stories ended in sorrow. Some freedmen erected monuments for parents who had died in chains, honoring them at last with dignity denied in life. They carved names in stone, adorned graves with flowers, lit lamps in their memory. These acts were triumphs, small victories snatched from the jaws of oblivion. In the end, death was both chain and key. It was the punishment Rome wielded, yet also the release slaves embraced. It was feared, yet also welcomed as escape. Between the lash and the grave lay only suffering. Beyond the grave lay the hope, however faint, of freedom. The empire marched on, armies conquering new lands, senators debating in marble halls, emperors cloaked in purple. Yet beneath it all, in fields, in kitchens, in mines, the enslaved lived and died. Their bodies fuel for Rome's greatness, their spirits fuel for memory. And when the empire fell, when its temples crumbled and its legions vanished, it was not the emperors who endured in whispers, but the nameless millions who had labored unseen. In their death lay a truth Rome could not silence, that humanity, even chained, is eternal. The empire that stretched from the mist of Britannia to the sands of Egypt, from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Arabia, was not built by senators, nor sustained by generals alone. Its foundation was silent, invisible, and vast. It was the labor of the enslaved, unnumbered, nameless, who bore upon their shoulders the weight of the Roman world. The economy of Rome was a living beast, and its heart beat with slavery. In every marketplace, in every villa, in every harbor, the work of slaves turned wheels, filled coffers, and raised monuments. Without them, the granaries would have been empty, the aqueducts dry, the roads broken, the palaces silent. In the fields, slaves were the lifeblood of agriculture. The fertile valleys of Italy, the plains of Sicily, the hills of Hispaniola were worked by chains. Grain was sown, harvested, and threshed by hands that did not own the fruit of their labor. Grapes were pressed into wine, olives into oil, not for the tables of those who gathered them, but for merchants and nobles whose wealth was measured in amphorae, piled high in warehouses. Latifundia, vast estates, became empires within the empire. Owned by senators and equestrians, they spread across the countryside, displacing free farmers who could not compete with the endless labor of slaves. Villages dwindled, small farms vanished, and the countryside grew quiet save for the murmur of chained voices in cities. Workshops echoed with their toil. Blacksmiths hammered iron for weapons. Cobblers stitched sandals. Potters turned clay into amphorae. Mills were turned not only by beasts but by men, their bodies harnessed to grind grain from dawn until dusk. Bakers kneaded dough, brickmakers shaped clay, weavers spun thread upon looms, each task mundane, each life consumed by repetition. Commerce flowed through ports where slaves carried bales of cloth, jars of wine, sacks of grain, and baskets of fruit upon their shoulders. They loaded ships bound for distant provinces, their sweat mingling with the salt of the sea. Rome's navy carried soldiers, but its merchants relied upon the enslaved to move the lifeblood of trade. Yet perhaps the most visible mark of slavery lay in stone. Rome was a city of monuments, her pride carved into marble and raised upon arches. The Colosseum, where thousands roared for blood, was built by hands in chains. Aqueducts, stretching like stone serpents across valleys, were raised by slaves who carried stones upon their backs. Temples rose, dedicated to gods, but their pillars were hewn and lifted by men whose prayers were silenced. To walk through Rome was to walk through a city of slaves. Every road paved, every fountain flowing, every bath steaming with water drawn from mountains was a testament not only to Roman ingenuity, but to the endurance of those who labored unseen. In war too, the enslaved played their part. They carried supplies for legions, marched behind columns with baggage, tended to wounded soldiers, dug trenches, raised camps. Some were forced to fight, armed and sent to the front lines as expendable shields. Others were gladiators, spectacles of death to amuse the citizens. Their combat, a cruel echo of real battles. Rome's wars created slaves, and slaves sustained Rome's wars. The circle was endless. Conquest brought captives, captives brought labor. Labor enriched Rome, wealth funded more conquest. In victory, Rome multiplied chains. In chains, Rome multiplied victories. And yet, within this system lay a contradiction. Rome called herself the land of liberty. Her citizens boasted of their libertas, their rights, their freedom from kings. They sang of the Republic, of the Senate and the people of Rome, of laws that bound rulers as well as ruled. Freedom was their most sacred treasure, the gift of their ancestors. But freedom was not for all. It was a privilege of birth, a boundary drawn to exclude. A citizen might walk proudly, his head high, proclaiming liberty, while a dozen slaves followed at his heel, carrying his burdens. A senator might speak of justice in the forum, while his household groaned with the weight of servitude. This was Rome's great paradox, that liberty for the few was built upon bondage for the many. The very concept of freedom shone brightest, because it was contrasted with slavery. To be Roman was to be free, and to be free was to own those who were not. Philosophers wrestled with this contradiction. Some declared it natural that the world was divided between those meant to command and those meant to obey. Others argued that slavery was fortune, that chance alone determined who fell into chains and who held them. Still others whispered that true freedom lay not in law, but in the soul, that a slave who mastered himself might be freer than a master enslaved by greed. But these were words. Words alone could not loosen iron. Among the people, slavery became invisible, normalized. A citizen saw not men and women but property as ordinary as tools. Children grew up with slaves in their homes, never questioning their presence, learning to command them as naturally as one might command a dog. Rome itself grew blind, unable to imagine a world without chains. Yet the enslaved remembered. Their songs, their stories, their prayers carried memories of lands without Rome, of lives without bondage. And in these memories, there was quiet resistance. They kept alive identities that empire sought to erase. They became both laborers and guardians of forgotten worlds. Even so, the empire prospered. Gold flowed into Rome, wine spilled from Amphiary. Markets thrived with goods from every corner of the earth. Senators boasted of wealth, generals of victories, poets of glory. Yet beneath it all, the foundation trembled. For an empire built upon chains could not endure forever. The contradiction sharpened as Rome aged. Citizens demanded greater rights, yet ignored those who had none. Freedmen rose in wealth, sometimes surpassing nobles, yet their origins stained them in the eyes of the elite. Slaves remained countless, yet their presence bred unease. For every master knew that behind obedience lay resentment. Thus Rome walked a narrow path, proud of liberty, blind to bondage, her greatness a mask worn over cruelty, and in that mask lay both her glory and her doom. History often speaks of emperors, senators, of generals who carved their names into marble and bronze. Yet scattered among the shadows are whispers of the enslaved men and women who, though bound in chains, left marks upon the world that time could not erase. Their stories were rare, fragile, but they shone like sparks against the darkness of silence. Among them was Epictetus. Born in Phrygia, far from the walls of Rome, he was taken young and sold to Epictetus, freedman of Nero. His life might have been one of ordinary servitude, forgotten among thousands. Yet fate bound him differently. Epictetus was cruel, his temper sharp, his punishments heavy. It was said he once twisted the leg of Epictetus so harshly that it broke. The boy, enduring the agony, is remembered to have said calmly, "If you continue, you will break it." And when the bone cracked, he murmured only, "Did I not tell you so?" From that day, he walked with a limp. Yet his spirit remained unshaken. In the midst of bondage, Epictetus discovered philosophy. He listened to Stoics, absorbed their wisdom, and turned his suffering into discipline. Though chained, he learned that the soul could not be enslaved unless it consented. Freedom, he taught, was not granted by masters, nor taken by emperors. Freedom lay in the mastery of one's own mind, in the calm acceptance of fate, in virtue unbroken by circumstance. In time, he gained manumission. No longer a slave, he taught in Rome and later in Greece, where his words drew students from across the empire. His discourses in Enchiridion spread through centuries, guiding emperors, scholars, and common men alike. Though born in chains, Epictetus spoke of freedom so profound that his voice echoes even now. Another name was Tiro, servant to Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator. Tiro was not merely a hand to hold scrolls or fetch wine. He was a mind, sharp and inventive. He created a system of shorthand, symbols swift as thought. They captured Cicero's words as they poured forth in court and senate. Thanks to Tiro, the speeches of Cicero survived, preserved with precision. Without him, much of Roman eloquence might have been lost. Cicero freed Tiro, and in freedom he continued to serve, not as a slave, but as a companion. He compiled, edited, and safeguarded his master's legacy, ensuring that Cicero's voice endured beyond death. His shorthand influenced writing for centuries, a gift born from the hand of one once bound. There was also Publilius Syrus, man of Syria, captured and sold as a youth. He became the property of a Roman noble, who, impressed by his wit, freed him. Publilius rose as a playwright, his comedies filled with sharp observations of human folly. His maxims, brief, piercing lines, outlived the stages upon which his works were performed. A rolling stone gathers no moss. A man's character is his fate. Such words born from a man once sold as chattel still shape tongues today. These names are remembered, but they are rare. For every Epictetus, Tiro, or Publius, there were millions whose lives passed without record, men who died in fields, their backs bent until they broke, women who perished in childbirth, their children taken and sold, children whose laughter faded into silence as they were carried away to strange households. Their names are not carved in stone, yet they too built Rome. Imagine an unnamed slave in the kitchens of a villa on the Palatine Hill. His days are filled with smoke, his hands blistered from turning spits, his arms weary from grinding grain. No historian records him, no poet praises him, yet each feast served 2 senators rests upon his labor. Or picture a woman in Sicily, bent over vines heavy with grapes. Her face is lined, her back hunched, her children beside her in the fields. The wine that flows from her toil fills goblets in Rome, yet her own lips taste only sour dregs. She dies one autumn, her grave unmarked, her story untold. Or a boy in the mines of Spain, lowered into darkness with pick in hand. He breathes dust, swings until his muscles fail, hears only the crash of stone and the cough of death. Remain beneath the earth, nameless, yet the silver he unearthed adorned the temples of Rome. These lives were countless, each unique, yet each consumed by the same fire of empire. They are forgotten by name, but remembered in presence. For in every road, every wall, every coin, their shadows remain. Not all stories ended in sorrow. Some masters, softened by loyalty or moved by conscience, freed their slaves, reedmen carved their pride into tombstones. I was once a slave, now I am free. They founded businesses, raised families, built legacies their children would inherit as citizens. Yet even in freedom, memory of chains lingered, carved into their very identities. Others bore cruelty until the end, their voices lost. But in the rare fragments of graffiti, in prayers scratched upon altars, we glimpse their humanity. One wrote simply, "At last I am my own." Another, "May the earth lie lightly upon me." Even nameless, they resist silence. Their stories, gathered like scattered embers, form a mosaic. Some burned bright like Epictetus, shaping thought for centuries. Some glimmered in quiet service like Tiro, preserving words not his own. Some shone with wit like Publius Syrus, their sayings echoing long after their voices faded. And millions more were sparks, brief yet necessary, who together lit the furnace of Rome. An empire remembers its emperors, but humanity remembers its slaves. for in them lies the measure of what it means to endure. As centuries passed, Rome itself began to change. The Republic had long yielded to the Caesars, and the Caesars themselves had risen and fallen like shadows. At sunset, armies marched across new frontiers. Emperors were crowned and slain. Marble crumbled, and yet through it all, the system of bondage endured, unbroken, as if it were eternal. But eternity is a fragile dream, even for empires. Slowly, imperceptibly, cracks spread through the foundation. The lives of the enslaved began to shift, not with sudden freedom, but with gradual transformation. In the early centuries, Roman law had granted masters absolute power vita nescis potestas, the right of life and death. A master might beat a slave to death and face no punishment, for the law saw no crime in the destruction of property, yet whispers of unease grew. Senators debated, philosophers muttered, emperors considered. Could an empire that prided itself on law continue to ignore the humanity of millions? By the reign of Augustus, restrictions began to appear. A master who killed a slave without cause could be accused of cruelty, if not punished as a murderer. Later emperors strengthened these protections. Claudius declared that abandoned, sick slaves left to die would be freed if they recovered. Hadrian forbade the killing of slaves without legal process, condemning cruelty as dishonorable to Rome itself. Antoninus Pius went further, declaring that a slave who sought sanctuary in a temple from excessive brutality must be heard. His master judged. These were small mercies, yet mercies nonetheless. They did not end chains, but they weakened their iron. Masters still held power, but the state began to whisper, even in bondage, slave is human. Religion, too, began to stir change. For centuries, slaves had prayed to many gods, their voices blending in temples and hidden shrines. But in time, a new faith took root, one born not of Rome, but of Judea. Christianity spread quietly, carried by merchants, whispered by prisoners, preached by men who feared not chains nor death. Its words were radical. In Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, for all are one. To those bound in iron, these words were fire. To those who owned them, they were unsettling, for they declared equality where Rome declared hierarchy. Slaves became among the earliest Christians. They gathered in secret, in catacombs beneath the city, their prayers echoing through tunnels. Lined with the dead, their masters and slaves knelt side by side, their voices mingling, their souls united. In the dim glow of oil lamps, they glimpsed a world beyond Rome, a kingdom where chains were broken, where dignity was restored. Martyrs arose, some of them slaves, who faced beasts in arenas, not as gladiators, but as witnesses to their faith. Their courage shook Rome, for in their deaths they showed defiance greater than rebellion. Rome could kill bodies, but it could not chain spirits aflame with belief. The church did not abolish slavery, not then. Even as bishops rose, even as emperors bent the knee to Christ, the institution endured, yet the seeds were sown. Slowly, inexorably, the idea spread that all souls were equal, that masters and slaves alike were dust before God. What law hesitated to say? Faith proclaimed. Meanwhile, the empire strained under its own weight. Invasions swept across borders. Barbarians pressed upon gates. Civil wars tore provinces apart. In these storms, slavery itself began to falter. War brought captives, yet Rome's strength to conquer waned. The flow of new slaves slowed, and masters turned to other forms of labor. Tenant farmers, serfs bound not by chains but by land. The system shifted, reshaped, transformed by the 4th and 5th centuries. Slavery remained, but it was no longer the engine it had been. The empire's heart was failing, its wealth diminished, its glory fading, the shadow of chains stretched. Still, but its edges blurred. When Rome finally fell, her legions broke and her walls were breached, slavery did not vanish. It endured, reshaped by kingdoms that rose in her place. In medieval fields, serfs bent beneath the same sun, their bondage different in name but not in spirit. In distant centuries, ships would cross oceans, carrying millions in chains, repeating Rome's cruelty on a scale even greater. Thus the legacy of Roman slavery was vast, stretching beyond the empire itself, imprinting upon the world a pattern of bondage that would not be erased for millennia. And yet, within this legacy lay another, the memory of those who resisted, endured, and survived. For Christianity carried forward not only the promise of equality, but also the memory of martyrs who had been slaves. Philosophy preserved the words of Epictetus, once bound, who declared that no man is free who is not master of himself. The plays of Publilius Eros endured, his wit sharper than chains. The shorthand of Tiro lived on, his letters binding history together. Their voices joined the silence of the nameless, whose bones lay in fields and mines and forgotten graves. They could not speak, but their presence whispered through time. Every ruin of Rome, in every broken column, in every faded mosaic, the unseen touch of their labor lingers. Rome had sought to silence them, to reduce them to property, to erase them in death. Yet in truth, Rome itself became their monument, its stones, its roads, its aqueducts. But humanity calls brothers and sisters. Thus the empire that prided itself on liberty left behind a paradox that endures. It proclaimed freedom while binding millions. It sang of justice while wielding cruelty. It built greatness upon suffering. Its fall was not only the fall of armies and emperors, but of the illusion that liberty could exist without equality. And, through the centuries, whenever men have sought to bind others, Rome has been remembered not only for her glory, but for her chains. The empire that had once seemed eternal began to falter. Its frontiers, stretched thin, buckled beneath the weight of endless war. Barbarians pressed upon the Rhine and the Danube, Goths swept into Italy, Vandals sailed across the seas, and legions that once struck fear into the world could no longer hold the tide within the crumbling walls. Famine and plague gnawed at the people. Gold dwindled, trade faltered, and the great machine of conquest that had fed Rome's hunger for slaves slowed to a halt. Without new captives, the markets grew thin. Masters turned to other means, binding peasants to land, demanding labor not through chains of iron but through chains of necessity. And so, as the empire staggered toward its fall, slavery itself began. To change, it did not vanish. Bondage never vanishes so swiftly. Instead, it bent and reshaped like iron hammered into new form. The coloni, tenant farmers bound to estates, took the place of field slaves. They were not sold in markets, not branded with irons, yet their lives remained fettered. They worked the soil not for themselves, but for lords, their freedom. Narrowed to the borders of fields, the collapse of Rome scattered fragments of slavery across the lands. In the east, the Byzantine Empire endured, and with it, the old traditions. Slaves still filled palaces, still rode ships, still labored in workshops. In the west, kingdoms of Goths, Franks, and Lombards inherited Rome's shadow. They too kept slaves, though their numbers were fewer, their roles shifting into household service, domestic toil. The intimate bondage of small courts, the memory of Roman slavery lingered in laws and customs. Medieval codes spoke of serfs, of bondsmen, of unfree tenants. Though the marketplace of Rome was gone, the essence of control remained. The lash was replaced by the demands of feudal lords, the branding iron by obligations of land. Yet the song was the same: labor without freedom, toil without reward. In monasteries, monks copied old Roman texts, preserving philosophy, law, and memory. Within those scrolls lay echoes of slavery legal codes that described punishments, letters that spoke of manumission, histories of Spartacus and Sicily's revolts. The monks who inked these words may have seen in them the reflection of their own serfs bending beneath burdens as old as empire. Christianity had grown strong, its bishops seated beside kings, its voice shaping laws. The faith that once whispered equality now spoke in the language of power. The church did not abolish slavery, but it tempered it. Masters were told to treat their servants with kindness, to remember that all souls face judgment before God. Some orders forbade the enslavement of Christians, drawing a fragile line between believers and heathens. Yet the institution itself remained sanctioned by silence, adapted to new ages. Through centuries, the ghost of Roman slavery lived on. When merchants sailed across seas in the age of discovery, they carried not only goods but also chains. Europeans cast nets across Africa, seizing millions to ship to the New World. They echoed Rome's markets. The bodies crammed into ships, the souls sold in squares, lives consumed by fields of sugar and cotton. These were not new cruelties, but ancient ones reborn, carried from the Tiber into oceans. And yet, memory also carried hope. Epictetus's words found readers among the enslaved of later centuries. His teaching that no man is free who does not master himself was whispered in plantations, a flame against despair. The story of Spartacus was retold, rebellion made legend, a symbol for all who longed for liberty. Even the wit of Publilius Syrus, preserved in fragile manuscripts, sharpened the tongues of thinkers who questioned the chains of their own age. Rome's slavery was both warning and legacy. It showed how an empire could rise upon bondage, yet also how bondage corroded the very idea of freedom it claimed to cherish. For the cry of Libertas that rang in the Senate was hollow, echoing only for the few, while the many groaned in silence. That contradiction endured, haunting every society that dared to speak of liberty while holding men in chains. When Rome fell, its marble temples crumbled, its aqueducts cracked, its roads grew over with weeds. Yet the slaves it had consumed left. No ruins, no monuments. Their legacy was different, carved not in stone, but in memory and consequence. The fields they plowed fed generations. The stones they set still stand in broken arches. The knowledge they preserved flows through history. In every ruined amphitheater where grass grows among seats, one may still hear their footsteps. In every worn stone of a Roman road, one may feel the pressure of their burdens. In every faded mosaic, one may glimpse the touch of their hands. Though their names are gone, their presence endures. And so the fall of Rome was not the end of their story. It was only a transformation, their bondage reborn in new guises, their suffering repeated in new lands. The empire perished, but the chains it forged rattled on, carried into ages that followed. Thus the legacy of Roman slavery is not confined to marble ruins or dusty scrolls. It is alive in the patterns of history, in the struggles of men and women. Across centuries, in the endless tension between liberty and bondage, Rome taught the world both the glory of freedom and the cruelty of chains. Her lesson was twofold: that greatness built on suffering cannot endure, and also that those who suffer can shape eternity. The centuries turned and the empire of Rome became dust. Its emperors, once clad in purple, are names in brittle books. Its legions, once thunder across the earth, are bones beneath forgotten soil. Its marble arches lean broken against the sky, ivy winding where banners once flew. But beneath the silence of ruins, a deeper memory lingers, not of emperors, nor of conquests, but of the countless unseen. The men and women who bore Rome's weight, who bled in its fields, who wept in its kitchens, who died nameless in its mines. They are the true shadows of Rome, shadows longer than any triumphal arch, deeper than any Senate decree. Their story is not carved in triumphal columns. Their names are not etched in marble. Their victories were not celebrated in parades. Yet without them, there would have been no empire. When the sun rose over Rome, it shone not only upon senators walking proudly through the Forum, nor generals raising standards upon distant hills. It shone upon chained men bent in vineyards, upon women grinding grain with weary arms, upon children fetching water with trembling hands. Their labor was the sunrise of Rome, their sweat its lifeblood. In the hush of night, when Rome slept, they remained awake. In kitchens, tending fires, in stables, soothing beasts, in sick rooms, wiping brows of masters, in mines, coughing in darkness. Even as the empire dreamed, their toil did not cease. Rome proclaimed Libertas, liberty, as her highest treasure. She raised statues to freedom, sang hymns to justice, declared the dignity of her citizens. And yet, beneath these words lay a silence of chains, a silence so vast that it swallowed millions. The paradox was Rome itself, the proudest freedom built upon the deepest bondage. And yet, even within chains, the enslaved endured. They sang songs in tongues Rome could not erase. They carved prayers into walls Rome could not silence. They whispered memories into children Rome could not forget. Their humanity resisted, quietly, stubbornly, like a seed pushing through stone. Some rose to names remembered: Epictetus, who taught that freedom begins in the soul; Tyro, who preserved the words of an orator; Publius Syrus, who turned wit into wisdom. They are sparks that still glow. But most remain nameless, like ashes scattered to wind. Their legacy is not in words, but in endurance itself. Rebellion came, swift and terrible, in Spartacus and Sicily. Rome crushed it, crucified it, displayed it as warning. Yet the crosses, along the Appian Way, became a forest that no memory could fell. Each body nailed there spoke louder than legions, that the desire for freedom cannot be killed, only delayed. When Christianity rose, when its whispers became hymns in catacombs, slaves knelt beside masters, their voices equal in prayer. For a moment, the illusion of hierarchy fell. The truth was revealed, that in death and in God there are no masters, no slaves. This truth endured, growing until it reshaped the world. The fall of Rome did not break the chain, only changed its shape. In feudal fields, peasants bent as slaves once bent. In ships that crossed oceans, millions endured bondage darker than Rome. The shadow stretched on, proving that empire was not the only tyrant. Humanity itself bore the weight of cruelty. But the memory of Rome's slaves lingered, carried into every age as both warning and mirror. They remind us that freedom for some, built upon chains for others, is no freedom at all. That the greatness of a nation measured in stone and conquest is hollow if bought with human suffering. That the truest monument is not marble, but the endurance of the nameless today. Rome is ruin. The Colosseum stands broken, its arches gnawed by time. The aqueducts stride still across valleys, but their waters are silent. The roads stretch on, but grass grows between their stones. And yet in each ruin, the touch of slaves remains. Their hands set the stones, their sweat mixed with mortars, their breath filled the air of construction. In ruins, they whisper still. So how much was a human worth in Rome? A handful of coins, a measure of silver, the price of a mule, the fortune of a philosopher. Numbers written in ledgers, shouted in markets, argued in courts. Rome gave them value in gold, in flesh, in skill, but their true worth cannot be counted. It is not in the price of auctions, nor in the sum of estates. Their worth is in the endurance that outlived empire, in the humanity that defied erasure, in the silent labor that built eternity. Their worth is in the truth that no chain can bind the soul. Rome fell, its emperors gone, its legions dust, its glory a memory. But the slaves who bore it remain in spirit, eternal as the stars. For history remembers not only kings, but also the nameless, and in remembering, we restore what Rome denied, the immeasurable worth of a human life.